2 letters and many warnings. A group of former and current military soldiers accuse the French president of giving in too much to Islamism. They claim the country's survival is at risk. A political maneuver, or does it reflect a real malaise of French society? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohammed Jamjoom. Civil war is brewing in France. That's the warning from a number of French soldiers to President Emmanuel Macron for the second time. They accused the president of granting what they called concessions to Islamism. The open letter was posted on a far-right website, Valeurs Actuelles, and echoed a similar text published last month by a group of retired generals. But this time it was open to the public, and the website says it received tens of thousands of signatories. At least 18 soldiers involved in April's letter face sanctions before a military court. Both letters were condemned by the French government, but welcomed by far-right leader Marine Le Pen, who is seen as Macron's main rival in next year's presidential election. In parts of the letter addressed to President Macron and his cabinet, soldiers said, "We are not talking about extending your mandate or conquering others. We're talking about the survival of our country, the survival of your country." They described themselves as part of a younger generation of soldiers who, quote, have offered up their lives to destroy the Islamism that you have made concessions to on our soil. They went on, if a civil war breaks out, the military will maintain order on its own soil. The French government reacted to the letter with fury. Prime Minister Jean Castex told Le Parisien newspaper that the letter was a political maneuver by the extreme right. Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin accused the anonymous signatories of the second letter of lacking courage. Defense Minister Florence Parly dismissed the text as part of a crude political scheme. France has seen several attacks in the past year, mainly blamed on what the government calls terrorist groups. Among them was the beheading of a teacher after showing Prophet Muhammad cartoons to his class. The attack has outraged the French, who called for the defense of Republican values. Macron launched a crackdown on Muslim groups following the attack. A number of mosques and Islamic organizations have been forced to shut down. Macron has also proposed a controversial bill to tackle what he describes as Islamist separatism. He was condemned by Muslims and leaders in several countries. Critics accuse the president of unfairly targeting Muslim groups. All right, let's bring in our guests. In Paris, Renaud Girard, chief foreign correspondent at Le Figaro. In Ifrane, Morocco, Nizar Messari, associate professor of international studies at Akhawayn University. And also in Paris, Yasser Louati, human rights activist and head of the Committee for Justice and Liberties. Welcome to the program. Yasser, let me start with you today. How significant is this second letter compared to the first open letter?
Well, unfortunately, it's really a doubling down on how things are going way to the far right in France. The first letter was published on 21st of April 2021 in commemoration of the aborted coup d'etat against General Charles de Gaulle back in 1961. And we have now the military meddling in civilian affairs, speaking of civil war and thousands of deaths. And we have now people who are in active duty in the military, doing the same thing. But what people have also missed is that there was a third call by a French police union, and this time it was calling for the application of Israeli methods, quote unquote, like the checkpoints in the Palestinian territories, and even to find inspiration from Duterte in the Philippines and Bolsonaro in Brazil. So what we see today is that the complete normalization of the far-right rhetoric, because we have normalized this alternative reality in which Muslims are the enemy within, conspiring to overthrow the French Republic. Nobody speaks of terrorism in terms of what is happening abroad, in terms of foreign intervention, has consequences here at home, and that French Muslims in their overwhelming majority just want to be French and want to be left alone. And my last point, sir, when people are going to accuse Muslims or so-called radical Islam of being the problem, Just give me one Muslim organization or Muslim leader that has called for separation from the republic, let alone to spark a civil war. This is the problem today. We have white supremacy in the military, and we have the normalization of this rhetoric that the military is the solution.
Renaud, from your perspective, how is this second open letter different from the first one? And also, do we at this stage know how many active members of the military actually signed the second letter?
For me, it is, you absolutely cannot draw a comparison with the putsch of the generals in April 61 in Algeria. They were head of real troops, and it was a putsch against Charles de Gaulle. The first letter was written by retired generals. Okay, they were a little bit paranoid about danger of a civil war, but as General Banteja, former chief of staff, wrote in the Figaro, they don't speak in the area of their own expertise. They speak as citizens. So, of course, you have freedom of expression and you can say whatever you like in France, but maybe it would have been better if they had not put their ranks in front of their name, General so, Colonel so, whatever. But for me, it's a little bit, as you say in English, a storm in a teacup. It is not a real movement. There is no rebellion. It's not the whole army. It's only several officers. Other officers have written alto feu, stop the whole thing. They said in Le Figaro, I speak of General Banteja. So I think that the Minister of Defense should not overdo this crisis. Yes, you can take some sanctions because generals have what we call an obligation of reserve. They cannot say they have to speak in accordance of the minister, but it's not that a big affair. It's don't make a storm in a teacup.
Yasser, I see you reacting quite a bit to what Renaud is saying there. Did you want to jump in?
I mean, I would have loved to be able to minimize and agree with Mr. Girard. The problem is it took 3 days for the government to react. 3 days. And the first op-ed by retired, indeed, generals has been accompanied, or there was a second op-ed signed, but this time by active duty military personnel. And we saw no investigation whatsoever. And we have not seen a reaction to actually call these people back into order. And yes, of course, the chief of staff did react, and he did his job. But the problem is, people don't take seriously the amount of threat this represents when the military personnel intervene in civilian life, but also when we have 58% of surveyed people in a French news outlet agreeing with that letter. So no, I mean, I would have loved to agree with that. But when you take a look at the overall atmosphere in France, the anti-separatism bill debates we have seen, and all this anti-Muslim rhetoric, my fear is that we have crossed went up another notch, and that now people will keep pushing forward, and this time asking for military intervention. Unfortunately, the government is not up to it, and now it's going to be on Emmanuel Macron and his people to bring the army back and send them back into their places of operation, which means they are what they call caserne.
Nizar, if we could just take a step back for a moment and look at the larger picture here. These letters are alleging that President Macron has made concessions to fundamentalist Islam. What exactly does that mean?
It means that he's not dealing seriously with what they see as extremist Islamist movement in France, which is not correct. In these two letters, some of the retired military and some of the current military are saying that they went to the front and they gave their blood or risked their lives for France. But when we see the conflicts in which they were contributing, Afghanistan and Mali, we see that they were confronting this so-called radical Islam and jihadist Islam. And I think that this is how they see the world. They see a world in which we have us against them, and they see that these Muslim community in France is the other. It's not part of France, and they see it as a threat, which is absolutely misleading to how that community lives in France and wants just to have its life and let alone. So I think that if we want to step back, we will see that these people bring a reading or an interpretation of the world that is confrontational, and they don't read only the word, but they read also France according to those lines of confrontation.
Renaud, the sentiments that we're seeing expressed in these letters, how much of an impact are they going to have on the upcoming elections?
It's true that you have upsetting events, that happened in France recently. You had this Islamist attempts a few years ago against Charlie Hebdo and against the concert of the Bataclan and so on. And you had recently a policeman killed, a lady policeman killed by an Islamist. And so it's true that you have problems, but I would say that this op-ed is a gross exaggeration of the threats that France is confronted to. But yes, you have a freedom of expression. It's very difficult to draw the line between a useful, I would say, freedom of expression, and happily enough, Charles de Gaulle, before the war, could express his views that were against the chief of staff of the time, and said that the French army was not well prepared. And it happened that General de Gaulle was true, because the French army was defeated by German army in 1940, and probably today he would be expelled from the army for writing against the état-major, the chief of staff. But on the current crisis or affair, we can say that it's an exaggeration, and especially we do not need the army in France to maintain law and order. We have police and we have la gendarmerie, and this is totally enough. So it's a little bit an exaggeration, and it's true that these generals, and it's a little bit a problem, they talk without, and it was said, I mean, they have an expertise in Mali or in Afghanistan, fine. The situation is not the same, of course, in French territory, though there are problems in France that should be addressed. This problem of violence and of, I would say, decreasing law and order in France is filling the rank of the right-wing party Front National, because
Renaud, sorry to interrupt you. Let me stop you there. I'm gonna pick up on that thread in just a few moments, but let me go to Yasser right now. Yasser, I want to ask you specifically about the fact that there are analysts in France who have said that of late President Macron has been tacking rightward, that he's trying to appeal to more right-wing voters. Do you believe that Macron is going to be embracing more right-wing policies and a more right-wing vision of how France should be ruled in the run-up to the election?
Well, actually, Emmanuel Macron has cornered himself. He thought that by pleasing the far right or the far right voters, that he would somehow give himself an edge over the rest. The problem is This is blowing up in his face. The first time it happened when Gérald Darmanin called Marine Le Pen, quote unquote, too soft on Islam. That's the Minister of Interior under Emmanuel Macron, calling her soft on Muslims. The second point is that his commemoration of Napoleon and not calling out slavery after we passed a law 20 years ago to call it a crime against humanity. All these are signs that Emmanuel Macron will continue on this right-wing downward spiral. The problem is that, sir, is that not only Emmanuel Macron is doing that, but we also have an overall normalization of the far-right rhetoric. As these op-eds have been signed, as Emmanuel Macron has shifted to the far-right, thinking he's going to win in the second round against Marine Le Pen, we also have a person like Général de Villiers, a former general in the French military, positioning himself as potentially a candidate. And he has been making, going from platform to platform on how law and order should be reestablished, how only the military could save France, given their experience. So there are really reasons to worry. So, of course, the op-eds was an overall exaggeration. Yes, the problem is that the overall context and the weak government we have and the social context in France makes it that these op-eds will go far beyond the initial intention. Yes, you make the buzz, but after all, you normalize the idea that far-right ideas are good for the country.
Nizar, is it at all possible to extrapolate from these two letters just how much the writers actually represent opinions that are shared among rank-and-file members of the armed forces?
Very difficult to do so because, well, the second letter was not even signed. I mean, there are anonymous signatories of the letter. But this is not something new in the French army. I mean, it's the French army. Let's remember here that some part of the French army aligned itself with the Pétain and the government of Vichy. The French army was also in 1961 resisted the independence of Algeria and rebelled against de Gaulle. So this fact of leaning to the extreme right is something that has existed in the French army for some time, and these two letters are revealing of that. But I think that the two letters reveal also of the malaise in France in dealing with the diversity and the challenge of inclusion. The French model is not far from being a total failure, but has failed in many ways. And the rebellions in 2005 reminded us how the French model did not meet the expectations of this new generation of purely French people, and we keep seeing this repeating itself. So I think that the letters are not as much revealing of a malaise within the army as they are revealing of a malaise within French society and French society that does not know, a French society that does not know how to deal with diversity and that does not know how to deal with to accept this diversity as a richness instead of a challenge as it has been defined.
Renaud, a few moments ago you were speaking about the far right in France. Let me ask you this. Does this, whether or not, as you said, you believe this is an exaggeration, a storm in a teacup, but does this in the end benefit the far right in France? Does it benefit far-right leader Marine Le Pen?
It's too early to say. There is a demand in France, and there was a poll recently, that the first request from French voters is law and order, safety in the streets, if you like. And unemployment was only second, and pandemic was only third. So it's very important to understand that law and order now is a challenge, is a big question in France, which was not so important like 20 or 30 years ago. So it's true that either Emmanuel Macron in his last year takes very strong measures to put back, if you like, law and order in France, and because we had like terrible examples just recently, like in in Avignon, a drug dealer just killed a policeman in the street in front of everybody. And they really request by the people, by the nations, and not by the high classes, by the popular classes. There is a request of more safety, of more security, and maybe of more severe punishment by judges. So this is true. And it's very simple. If Macron is not able to deliver on that matter, which is requested by the French people, and we still have a democracy and still people can vote whatever mainstream media tell them to do. If Macron does not meet these challenges, there is a possibility that Marine Le Pen is elected president, yes?
Yasser, I saw you reacting. We are starting to run out of time, so I'm just going to ask you to please keep your answer brief. But did you want to jump in?
Yes, definitely. I mean, how much more can Emmanuel Macron do? He cracked down on civil liberties, human rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, permanent state of emergency, laws of mass surveillance. Now, Emmanuel Macron cannot do more than that. So, but what we can say is Marine Le Pen can benefit in the short term, but in the long term, she has a credibility problem. And only time will tell whether a person from outside of the political spectrum may arise, like Emmanuel Macron did, or if Emmanuel Macron sets up the election to be about him against Marine Le Pen, and in which case he will play the card, I am as hard on as her, but I come with the credibility of having been a president.
Nizar, let me ask you this. What can Emmanuel Macron do right now when it comes to these letters? We have seen repeatedly that members of the government are quite upset that these letters have emerged. Actions to punish some of the officers have been proposed. But all in all, what can be done? And if more action or more punitive action is taken, would that backfire on Macron and his government?
I think I would agree with the second part of your question, absolutely. I think that very little can be done because, as it has been said here previously, there is freedom of speech in the country, so people should be able to express their mind. And at the same time, the victimization will play in favor of these people if they are repressed. And as it was also mentioned, opinion polls show that some of the arguments in these letters have the support of a substantial part of the French population. So I think that Emmanuel Macron does not have the choice of repressing hardly those who signed those letters, and he has to do his policies. But if his policies are to keep siding with the right, I think he might be leaning to the far right. I should better say. I think that people might think, well, why are we going to vote for the imitation? Let's go to the original, and that's the risk for French democracy, from my point of view.
Nizar, very quickly, also one last question. Are there actually any laws in France that forbid members of the military from expressing opinions like this in public? And in a more broad way of looking at it, what does the military, or most members of the military, what would they think about the fact that there is now this mixing between the political and the military based on these statements, these letters?
The leaders of the army are against, and expressed it clearly, that these letters are against the spirit of the army and the non-alignment of the army in the French political spectrum. So the leaders of the military are clearly positioning themselves against these letters. However, and some measures will be taken against those who signed the first letter, since the second letter was anonymous. But I think that there is, in politics, there is what is legal and there is what is doable in a political, from a political point of view. And that is what Macron and his assistants will need to take into consideration at this stage.
All right, we have run out of time, so we're going to have to leave the discussion there. Thank you so much to all of our guests, Renaud, Girard, Nizar Messari, and Yasser Louati. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohammed Jamjoom, and the whole team here, bye for now.